Ladies and gentlemen, in 1983, I was commissioned by this museum to create an art piece commemorating George Seurat's painting A Sunday Afternoon on the Island of La Grande Jatte. On this occasion, I present my latest Chromolume.
Number 7.
Which pays homage to La Grande Jatte and to my grandmother, Marie.
Welcome to Putting It Together, the podcast that goes through the entire body of work of Stephen Sondheim, show by show and song by song. My name is Kyle Marshall, your self-described Sondheim expert. I know that this week, Mr. Sondheim's townhouse has gone up for sale, but I do think that if we all combine $15, the sad thing is we still probably couldn't afford it, but it looks gorgeous. Anyways, we are here to talk about Chromolume number 7. Now, there is no lyrics to this song, so we're not going to be going through anything about the actual lyrics of this piece, but my guest, Lucas Rougeux, and I have a really great conversation about the nature of art, not just in the 1980s, but also in present day. Before we get to that, I just wanted to address 2 emails that I have received here in recent weeks. The first comes from Jeremiah, who wrote in about our It's Hot Up Here episode, and I was mentioning with my guest Christine in that episode about, I don't actually know if this song is an example of a gavotte or not, because there's a lyric in there that mentions a gavotte, which is a musical style, and I just was not smart enough to know whether or not this was an example of one. Anyways, Jeremiah writes in and says, I always took the line originally as the fact most of the characters in the painting are portrayed as strolling through the park, so gavotte could reference that, like a pretentious promenade through the park to see and be seen. The other thing musically about a gavotte is that the melody generally begins on beat 3 of the measure. And It's Hot Up Here, funnily, a lot of the declarations in it also begin on or are emphasized on around beat 3. So example, there's 1, 2, it's hot. 1, 2, the soldiers have forgotten us. So anyways, so I think maybe Sondheim was playing a little bit around with this idea of things happening on the 3rd beat of the measure. And then I just realized the second one was not actually an email message, but it was a comment that was left on the Patreon. And this is Deborah, who is commenting about some of the character moments within Act 2. So specifically with the characters of the painting, she writes, I think the characters in the painting who are singing at the beginning of Act 2 are definitely the characters George created mostly in his mind. Characters who perhaps have little in common with their real-life counterparts. I'm sure George also used observation and eavesdropping in his creation process, but essentially the characters on the canvas are his creation. She then goes on to have some other subpoints here, writing, about George's mother and the tree, as Sondheim knew from personal experience, you can never please a mother. 3, the boatman schwitz is definitely Yiddish for sweats or perspires. My parents and grandparents spoke Yiddish and English speckled with Yiddish expressions, and I often heard them say things like, I'm schwitzing. 4, the tall grass. Note that Jules likes tall grass for his trysts, but this links him to the dog in Act 1 who really likes grass. So Jules, the critic, is equated with a dog. 5, even though they never see you, the nurse's front is not visible in the painting. She's only a fragment, but still important as the boy in a tree and the warrior under the treaty house in Pacific Overtures are just a fragment of the day. And then finally 6, the characters in the painting are not looking at each other. They have trouble connecting, as does George. It is only through his painting that he's able to connect the dots. Ha ha. Anyways, I have some really great listeners who are so smart, and I love it when people write in to elaborate on what they're thinking about any given lyrics and songs that we talk about. So continue doing that. Thank you so much. Well, this is not to delay anymore. Let's get into my conversation with Lucas Rougeux about Chromolume number 7.
My apologies, ladies and gentlemen. For precise synchronization of all the visual elements, I have installed a new state-of-the-art Japanese microcomputer, which controls the voltage regulator. I think that the surge from the musical equipment has created an electrical short, and unfortunately, no electricity, no art. If you just give us a moment, we can bypass the regulator, and then we'll be back in business, all right?
Lucas Rougeux, thank you so much for coming back.
Thanks, Kyle. I'm so excited to be here. Ages ago, this is what I emailed you to be part of, and you roped me in to be a part of the show earlier than this, but here we are.
Here we are. Just to set everyone up on the same page here, this is going to be kind of a very different episode. We've done a few of these in the past where we do an episode on a song that doesn't really have lyrics to it. And this is true for this song. It has always been a track listing, even from the original Broadway cast of Chromolume number 7. But I think there's going to be a really cool conversation we're going to have about the nature of art, both in the 80s and nowadays. But
yeah,
let's start broad here first. This is Sunday in the Park with George. So do you remember the first time you encountered this show?
Yeah, I don't know how I came upon it, but I remember I was in art school. Like I had already been a fan of Sondheim by then, like obsessed with Sweeney Todd, loving A Little Night Music. And I think I was just like getting into the woods. Yeah, I don't know how I came upon it, how I knew about it, but I ended up watching the, Mandy Patinkin, Bernadette Peters recording and absolutely loving it. I was just sort of starting out and wanting to pursue art and wanting to be an artist. I think like there are a lot of things obviously that I think I missed and didn't quite latch onto at the time, being, like I think like a junior in college or in undergrad. But like the sentiments in Move On really stuck with me. I feel like the show's most famous words of, give us more to see, anything you
right.
Let it come from you, and like for a visual artist, I think that is such I don't know. It's such a boon to think about and to sort of get rid of all the things that you're sort of bombarded with in terms of being an artist and all the challenges that you're going to be facing and especially a lot of the internal challenges of like is my art good enough? Is it original enough?
Mm-hmm.
And obviously these questions that George number 2 kind of faces a little bit in putting it together. But I was so taken by it and I loved it so much.
I mean, forgive my ignorance. This is probably like a really dumb question, but you being in art school, like, I guess at what point do you like, this is the type of art that I want to pursue? Like, is that something you're coming in with a preconceived notion of, or is it something that's being kind of molded while you're at school?
Yeah, for me personally, I think I've always been interested in art making very broadly. I think there were certainly some mediums and materials and processes that I was intrigued by. I was actually very lucky to take a 3-week-long painting course at the Art Institute of Chicago, and we got free reign of the museum, and I saw Seurat's work, though I was more inclined on the contemporary wing.
Sure.
But painting was something that I was intrigued by going into college. But I also knew that I wanted to do more than just visual art and making art. I pursued a liberal arts degree with a visual arts focus. So it was a lot of writing overlap and a lot of just like a liberal arts education that I wanted to pull different ways of thinking and understandings of the world that would eventually influence my work. And the classes that I took in my particular major, they sort of focused us on having a broader thirst for knowledge of types of art rather than saying like if you want to be a painter, just do painting classes. And there were a lot of like people in my art school that went in knowing that they wanted to be a painter and just like kept on taking painting classes and drawing classes and things and really solidified that. And I went to a well-known ceramic school. It was known for the ceramic arts and ceramic engineering. So there are a lot of people that were pulled to the ceramic program because of that. So there are a lot of ceramicists that were either molded, pun intended, by the whole experience, or eventually the school sort of like introduced them to these materials, and that's what kind of solidified their making. But I think the way that I went about going to art school was very like, I want to try as many different things as I can while I have the opportunity to. Like, even though I went in with a desire for painting and drawing that I learned from that little course in Chicago, I knew that I could paint and draw when I was like visiting my parents at home. Like between summer breaks, I would paint in my parents' basement. So I didn't necessarily think that I needed to pursue a whole lot of painting and drawing. Even though I took some classes here and there, I knew I wanted to explore other things. I wanted to explore ceramics. I did neon. I did like performance art. I did, all sorts of different things that I couldn't, just sort of figure out myself.
I can understand then, like coming from your point of view and your background, like how Sunday in the Park with George probably speaks a lot to you primarily like as an artist struggling to find, a meaning in the world, especially in Act 2. Like that is really George's struggle.
Yeah.
I don't know. Is that what draw you to it the most, or is there another element of the show that you pick up on?
Yeah, I think in general, the art history element of it was not something that I think I would be immediately focused on, particularly in the first act. I think what I was really engaged with on the first act was the romance of it and the intense emotions around these characters and the story that was being told, not necessarily for the time period and for the artist, even though I've grown to love Seurat through this work. But yeah, I think it really definitely solidified my love for this show in the second act, where it really hammers home these ideas of what art is, what being an artist is, and the sort of like lifelong pursuit of art. Overall, the show, through the different Georges and ways that George sort of interacts with his process and with his subject matter and with his muses, I guess, it really touches on, I think, a lot of questions that a lot of artists are facing all the time of like, am I, and I think questions that have come up in talking through the first half of this season over the course of the show is when you're an artist and you're like deep in the mode and you kind of forget about the life outside and you sort of squander sometimes personal relationships and is your practice and your art worth it if you're sort of like living separated from the people that are maybe important to you, like all these massive questions. And then eventually, like in Act 2, whether or not your work is any good, is it
right.
important, is it new, is it
going to span 100 years, right?
Yeah, right, exactly. Should you be, but also the question, should you be making work that is meant to last 100 years? Was George Seurat making work to last for hundreds of years? Who knows? But yeah, these sort of existential questions and the very poetic nature of the show, I think that touched on so many elements of my wheelhouse, that I think, yeah, this show is absolutely my top 3 musicals of all time.
I mean, because we're talking about the second act, the one question that I am asking every single person is whether you need the second act or not, which basically I've never received an alternate answer yet. But
yeah, I mean,
that's the debate that sometimes people get into, is whether or not you need the second act for this show to work.
Who is debating this? I want to know. I think other guests have said, the first act is really lovely. It's it's a lovely story. It has this very emotional, romantic, and tense relationship between an artist and the person that he loves. But the second act really solidifies these grand ideas, and I think what the second act does really well also is what I think sometimes period pieces struggle with sometimes, is trying to bridge the gap for audiences seeing a piece now and figuring out why does it matter to me? Why should I be thinking about this? And that's such a hard, that's such a big challenge for a lot of people that are making period pieces, whether they be like movies, TV shows, stage plays, musicals. Like you're trying to make this story timeless, reach an audience that is not there, and you have to find a way to say like this story is important for you in 20 whatever to be watching this. So like, you got to tell me why. And I think Sunday in the Park with George, it very literally brings us to, at least at the time, modern day. And I think, now still it has this amorphous modern day as opposed to the late 1800s that is like, okay, this is closer to the reality that you're sitting in. So, you can feel it more deeply. It's not this distant romantic idea. It's things that are happening now and ideas and people that you could meet and come across.
That's the other thing about this musical in particular, right? Which is when it is first produced, the second act is contemporary. We're talking about the art of that time.
Yeah.
And now, the older we get, it's like actually both halves are period pieces.
Yeah.
It takes on this new form a little bit. It's like the first act is very much a period piece, and the second act is also one that we have to contextualize. It's 100 years later, but what was art like in the 80s? Like, there's all this other questions now that we have.
Yeah, it is such an interesting quandary that I think people that are going to be making this musical in the future is going to be facing. And I was thinking too, like, the further and further we get from the mid 80s, like, is there going to be a desire to make a 20 something 2030 thing, like, jump forward? And would there be a, like, I don't know, an edit? Well, I don't know, like, because it's...
I think you could, with a very slight amendments. I think there is a way that you could say, like, I don't know, let's say it's coming out next year, like, it is happening in 2024.
Yeah.
And instead of Marie being his grandmother, it could be like his great grandmother, or how we want to, like, frame that. So she's a slightly different relation to it. And, like, she remembers her mother or her grandmother talking to her about this story. I mean, it's not the most elegant solve for it, but there is ways I think you could fit that in.
There is, but the ways in which Marie, like, in the second act, talks about her mother and talks about Dot and how it relates so deeply to the previous story in the previous act. Like, I think it would be a really hard challenge, but maybe something worth trying. And I think the way in which they kind of approach the revival with Annaleigh Ashford and Jake Gyllenhaal, I didn't watch all the way through the second act, but I think with things being so pared down, just visually and the production wise, was very minimal, at least from the, like, slime tutorial that I saw. It was very minimal, and not like the costuming was not, like, deeply set in the 80s, like the ways in which they sort of, like, set the whole stage. It wasn't, like, very 80s feeling. So I think they kind of were like, technically, if you think about it, we're in the 80s right now, but it also feels very modern and right now, because we're also watching Jake Gyllenhaal on stage, and I don't know, if it's very contemporary.
And asking the question, what was his relationship like with Taylor Swift? I saw that scarf in that music video. I'm pretty sure that's all about you.
Right. Who is Annaleigh Ashford, if not
the Taylor Swift analog?
If not the Taylor Swift of contemporary musical.
Yeah. Hi everyone, just kind of breaking into the conversation to let you know about some of the people who make this show continue to go. If you'd like to help support the show for absolutely free, you can give a rating and review on whatever app you listen to podcasts in. That's greatly appreciated. Putting It Together is an independent podcast, so if you'd like to help monetarily, which will only help to grow and make this show better, you can do so over at our Patreon page. Please do not donate if it impacts you negatively financially. I also need to give a huge thank you to the God That's Good tier from Patreon. You can go and find out more at patreon.com/puttingittogetherpodcast. The God That's Good tier is Jack, Todd, Robert, Louise, Christopher, Stephen, and Derek. All right, let's get back to the show. What are we talking about here today, Lucas?
We're going to be talking about art. We're going to talk about, we're going to, I feel like we're going to put, at least I'm going to put on my, what's her name? Blair, I want to say Blair
Daniels.
Blair Daniels hats and think as an art critic and look at Chromolume number 7, look at how George number 2 is sort of introduced, and Marie is sort of introduced as characters in Act 2.
That is correct. I just wanted to once again call out, this was said in a previous episode, but I feel like it should be stated every single time. Barbara Brine, who was the original, like, Blair Daniels and the mother in the original production.
Yeah.
One of my all-time favorite line readings ever is when he says, like, I like your piece on neo-expressionism, and she's like, good for you. Like, I love how devastating that is.
She's so good. The actress who plays Blair and the mother in the revival, she does a good job, but truly, like, the best casting was in that original, that just scathing and intense, like, oh, good for you,
Now, do you recall, this is basically, we're talking about the scene in which the Chromolume is unveiled. Do you recall, like, what is happening, like, right before this starts?
Yeah, right before this. It's a weird scene where the Seurat's painting itself, like, after everyone sings It's Hot Up Here, it's a very, like, sort of meta, jokey sort of song that brings us back into Act 2. And then like every player is sort of giving little tidbits about what happened to George after the painting up until he dies. And the way that they all speak about him is in a very like, I mean, obviously it's a very retrospective way of speaking about him. But a lot of them have, I would say most of them have a very like reverential and almost like positive way of speaking about him. Even like Jules, who, you know, like has been like, you know, floundering back and forth about like whether or not he likes his work or respects him as an artist. Like he kind of like solidifies like, no, I always respected it. And I'm like, okay, you know, it's a very strange.
It's an interesting thing. I will say, for people who are listening, you can go back to our last episode because my guest and I did have a brief discussion about that scene in particular. Because it is an interesting way to follow up its hot up here with that.
But they're slowly dissipating. Like, you know, we just saw the completed painting and all the characters are just complaining about their existence as a painting and what it means to be solidified forever. But then they're just piecemeal, just breaking apart until like the whole scene shifts into a very modern day. But I think it is really intriguing that they just like dots, like, you know, like particles, they all just disperse.
The somewhat of a joke here is that then we meet this second George, his grandmother Marie. Sorry, yes, thank you for correcting me. His grandmother Marie. She, of course, is the baby that Dot was carrying at the end of Act 1. And the joke being is that the Chromolume then doesn't work.
Yeah.
Like it knocks out the power and they're trying to get it back up and running again. They finally kind of get it up and running again. And I just wanted to read this quick back and forth exchange between George and Marie.
Yeah.
This can be found on pages 348 and 349 of the Putting It Together book that James Lapine came out with here a few years ago, talking about the process of putting this show on. And then he includes the entire script in the back, which has been really good for this season for me. As the Chromolume gets put back on, it says, like, the lights dim and the presentation continues. The music gathers momentum. The Chromolume begins several seconds before the speaking resumes, with images from the painting projected on its sphere illustrating the lecture. Marie goes, "When I was young, Mother loved telling me tales of her life in France and of her work as an artist's model." George. Her mother showed her his great painting and pointed to this woman and said that it was she. Marie. And she pointed to a couple in the back. They were holding an infant child, and she said that was me. George. Shortly before my great-grandmother's death, she spoke of her association with the artist of this painting. She told Marie that Seurat was her real father. Marie, I was shocked.
Big laugh, big laugh, big laugh.
Big laugh, big laugh. George, my parents never believed this story. After all, there was no proof. I do not. Then Marie produces a red book, unbeknownst to George. My mother gave me this small red book. George, Marie, oh, George, I wanted to bring this book and show it. And then she turns to the audience. In the back are notes about his great-grandfather, the artist. George, actually, this book is really just a grammar book in the handwriting of a child.
Right.
And though there are notes in the back which mention a George, they could be referring to anyone, Marie, but they do not. George, I do not know that there is any validity in this story. Marie, of course there is validity. And then she turns to the audience. He has to have everything spelled out for him. And then George finally says, the facts are sketchy, the tales are many. I would like to invite you into my Sunday, Island of Light. It will be on exhibition here in the upstairs gallery for 3 weeks. And then the notes say, music crescendos as laser beams burst over the audience. When they complete their course, the sphere begins to turn, sending out a blinding burst of light. The painting flies in. So that's basically setting us up here for like the little light show that we hear on most of the recordings.
Yeah.
Anything that you wanted to bring up about that little back and forth scene at all?
Yeah, I think it's so interesting in this little instance that we get such a clear picture of who both of these characters are. And I think the fact that we as an audience know previously that red book is a thing that Dot had, and George calling it the handwriting of a child, we know it wasn't a child, and we know it was somebody that was just trying to learn how to read. Just the fact that we as an audience know that Marie's story, whether or not we believe
is true,
whether or not we believe the, and true historic fact or whatever that the first existed or whatever.
At least in the fiction of the play, it's true.
It's true. So we see George, this second George, refuting that so intensely. I think it's painful to watch, because it's this older woman who is defending this story that I think gives a lot of intrigue and like romance to their lives. You know, I think there is a brief little moment where Marie says like, I was a Floridora girl once. Like I think everybody, you know, every person is trying to find ways in which their lives are important. Their lives mean a lot. They've been connected to important people or important moments. And I think for Marie, that red book and that story saying that you are George Seurat's daughter is something massively important to her. And you can see that. You can see how she's like, I don't know, she holds on to it so intensely, whether or not it's something that's traceable, you know?
I think this is like the emotional arc too that happens in the second act. Is like the Red Lesson book is obviously important in Act 1, but I think it becomes very important in Act 2 because it's what ties George to his past and I think to his family much more so. Like there's an entire song called Lesson Number 8 that he's reading out and interacting with. And it's like, what do these words mean? Like he's incorporating the lessons that his great grandfather would have been spouting out when he was painting. So
yeah, exactly. And the ways in which George is refuting it, you know, in front of all these people in this big, you know, in this important art opening event is not just kind of like going like, oh, haha, grandmama, you know, like, and just kind of like refuting any sort of claims when people ask him questions later. Like he's doing it publicly. There is no historic backing. There's no claims. There is no factual evidence. Like he's listing up very like analytical ways of refuting this, which is such I don't know, it's a very interesting way in which a person who claims to be an artist.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't really think about this until you just brought this up, but it does put him to stark contrast almost with George Seurat from the first act, because George Seurat is all about like, you know, going to different places and sketching different people and objects and animals and then putting them all together into a painting. None of that is like realistic. None of it is he really all that concerned with, well, like the facts have to line up and it has to be exactly this tree or it has to be exactly this person at the same time.
Right.
He doesn't care about that. He's looking at the whole of everything. And it looks like almost that this George is concerned too much with like the minutia, like this little thing that I can't see the grand picture that I'm trying to make.
Yeah. I mean, I have many thoughts about what kind of artist George is, how he's sort of relating to the time period also.
Might as well get into that, honestly. I was going to wait for a little bit longer, but let's just jump into that now because I actually don't know how I feel about it. Part of me, for these types of installation pieces that I have experienced in my life, I don't know if there's been any time where I've been like, oh my gosh, this was like a life-changing experience for me. Most of the time it's like, this is cool, it's interesting, or it's like, that's a really fascinating way that you combine this. But I don't know if any of it stayed with me like a fine art piece or a sculpture or something like that.
Yeah.
So I don't know. How do you take it? I guess, what's your take on it?
Yeah, I mean, so I like, if we're looking at, you know, say the original production and their Chromolume, it's this like very like sci-fi looking sculpture.
Spaceship-y thing.
Thing. Yeah, absolutely. And there's a light show of some capacity, you know, with the idea that perhaps like lights are sort of overlapping in the same, you know, colored lights are sort of overlapping in the same way that the idea of Seurat's work, you know, with paint. And then in the, you know, Broadway revival with Jake Gyllenhaal, the sculpture itself was, you know, these sort of string lights, this sort of netting of string lights, with a bulb at the very end of them. They sort of like wave up and down in the theater. Like there's this, it's a large display and it's very pretty. It's very interesting. But like you were saying, it doesn't have much like art to it or interesting thing beyond the sort of formal intrigue of it all. Like you were saying, these sort of things, these like light shows or these, you know, these sort of installations are interesting to look at for a moment, but there isn't anything deeper than that.
I don't even know if that's a bad thing necessarily. I don't know if I'm saying that as a negative thing, but it's just something I've always noticed. This is what I'm going to bring up, that very recently, if people do follow me on Twitter or Instagram, I actually got to see like kind of an actual Chromolume from this company in a neighboring city. Theirs was more so connected to a bunch of individual light balls that could change different colors. and they interacted with how you yourself moved around the object.
Yeah.
So again, really cool experience. I really enjoyed it. And then at the end, I was like, yeah, that was cool.
Yeah.
But I don't know if there's anything more than that.
Yeah, I think that piece has that you went to see is like touching closer to where I think George's like potential has, and like touching closer to a more solidified artwork. And I think we're definitely not meant to like Chromolume number 7. Regardless of the ways in which like the book kind of says, like just including like number 7, I think that, a lot of people say like, oh, did you need to make 7 of them? I think that's kind of a little simple joke, solidifying its unimportance.
At least how I take it is almost like he's gotten stuck basically doing a similar thing over and over and over again without trying to push out into something different. I mean, that's kind of what Move On is all about. At the same time, like that's the hardest struggle I have. I've had other guests that have kind of mentioned this about them just not really enjoying Chromolume number 7, like the actual art piece itself.
Yeah.
Which I agree with you. I don't think we're supposed to.
Right.
However, I think we're still supposed to believe that he's good at what he does.
Yes.
So that's a hard thing to communicate, I think, to the audience.
It is. And how I think they achieve that, and I think that touches on what kind of artist George is in the 80s, is the fact that like he technically knows a lot. He knows so much. Like when things short circuit in this presentation, he lists off this like technical jargon, like the Japanese microchips and short circuits and the regulators and all that. Like, and he says it very confidently, like he knows the ins and outs of this machine like nobody's business. But I think what he's lacking, is perhaps the reason why he's making this work. In the 80s, I would say there starts to be a deeper connection to the consumerism, capitalism, ideas of mass production, and those touch upon the art world in the 80s. And there are certainly different kinds of artists that are either acknowledging it, using it, or making fun of it, And I think George is an artist that's kind of utilizing the capitalism that is rolling into the art scene, at least like, from a perspective in New York. Obviously this painting would be in Chicago at the time, and that's likely where he would be. But I think, at least in like the New York art scene, there are artists like, Basquiat and Keith Haring that are doing these very punk works that are very like subversive and very grungy and very like, F the man and all that. There's photography that's becoming very large with Cindy Sherman and Nan Golden that are, that photography is becoming an art form that is meant to be looked at, but which previously was...
And political statement. I mean, I guess it's always sort of been a political statement, but very much like forcefully becoming a political statement.
Yeah. And then there are artists like Jeff Koons, who is starting to make a big name for himself in the 80s, particularly for how he's making art. Jeff Koons was he wasn't an artist that went to art school to be an artist. He was like a businessman beforehand. So he knew a lot of the ins and outs of the art market, the ways in which art buyers are interested in an artwork, formal qualities of an artwork that could be interesting, trends. Like he's looking at things in a very business-like way. And the way that he was making art, especially in the 80s, was a factory. He hired like hundreds of people to make his work. And I think this is, and a lot of his work, from my perspective, I don't like Jeff Koons' work. It's empty. It doesn't have much to say outside of the fact that like, okay, you made a metal balloon animal. Great. Like there isn't much heart to it, but it does really well because Koons knows the art market and knows how to work it. And I think George is a Jeff Koons. I think he's an artist that has, he has a lot of knowledge, and I think I will give George a little bit more credit than that, but he has a lot of knowledge as to ways in which the art world works, at least in the 80s. And he knows that he needs a lot of help in the technical sense. Like he hires a bunch of these different people to help build his machine. He's not necessarily disconnected from that because he is making them. I firmly believe that he is doing some of the work because he has the knowledge of it, but he needs money.
Yeah, I really wanted to push into this because not to overstep into the putting it together discussion that'll happen next week.
Yeah.
But that is kind of the big difference. Like if you read up about George Seurat, not that it's really brought up in this play very much. George Seurat came from money. Like he had a rich family. So like, yeah, he could go away and just like paint what he wanted to and do whatever he want. I think we're supposed to understand that this George, not really. Like he requires to get to go and hobnob with people and get these commissions and get the money so he can do his machines and keep going. And so I think he's gotten into this weird rhythm where it's like, well, I know what's going to sell.
Yeah.
I know how to sell this. So I'll just keep doing the same thing. But it still requires me to go on these circuits and like talk to these boring people so they give me the money so I can go and do this hard thing. And that's a hard system to break out of when it's like, you know that this is what's selling.
Yeah, it's a hard system to break, and it's a scary one too. Like, you know, there are so many artists that end up sticking with a particular style or vision and they don't break away from it because they know what is selling of theirs. And, you know, there's so many people that are afraid that if I do something new, is it going to sell in the same way? Is it going to be interesting in the same way? Am I going to, you know, have the following in the same way? And I think, you know, for George to be commissioned by, you know, in this fiction by the Art Institute of Chicago to make a work in dialogue with Seurat's painting, and then to be asked by the French government to bring this work to be shown on that, like that's a massive deal. That's a huge get. What, you know, however much he's being paid for it, like who knows, but like that's a big publicity thing. That's a big, you know, stamp on your artist resume that you did this. Like you're not just in dialogue with like some random painting or whatever in a museum's collection. Like this is a big name art museum and it's a big name artwork, you know. So like he knows he's doing well, but you're right. He's so trapped in the need that like I need money for these things. And I think, you know, if you're listening to Putting It Together very closely, the ways in which he's talking about his process is just making money. It's finding ways to make money. It's raising money. It's how to talk to the right people. There's no talk at all about putting, you know, brush to canvas. Like there's no process talk about building these machines, where his thoughts are about them, where, you know, what themes he's thinking about, what, like, you know, dialogues he's making with other artworks and with art history. Like there's nothing like that.
I think this is the part where you can really feel Sondheim's connection to this, because he's written about this extensively and talked about this extensively. Like he really lived through the change of Broadway into like a multi-million-dollar, I don't know how to put this nicely,
industry
billboard to get families to come and watch musical theater. Like that's basically like he saw like the ever changing from the 50s up until the early 2000s.
Yeah.
And he talks about how it's like there was a time when he was starting out where you could like put up a show, fumble around with it and kind of figure it out. And now it's like there's just too much money. There's just too much money you have to raise before you even say like I want to cast a person. Like there's just so much that you have to go and do for it.
Yeah.
Now, he was probably much removed from the actual going and getting money from people, but I'm sure he sympathized with like, we just want to do this thing. That means that someone has to go and find like hundreds of thousands of dollars to set up a workshop to do this thing.
Yeah. And
then $1 million guarantee to put it on in this theater.
Yeah.
And it just becomes like about accountants rather than like an artist wanting to make something.
Right. Semi unrelated to this, but I heard this whole dialogue about Hollywood and the film industry being like that now, of there being this intense desire to only produce big blockbusters. But it's like we can't have big blockbusters all the time. Like there's no...
all the time. Like this is the and I guess that's the thing too. Even on Broadway, it's like it's not like down with the blockbuster musical. It's like that shouldn't be what every single show is, or it starts to like erode your actual art form.
Exactly. And that's not the only way to achieve a level of success in
right.
You know,
I will refrain from getting up on my soapbox because I could literally talk for hours about how Hollywood is kind of imploding right now.
Yep.
With some very key things that have failed at the box office, and then streaming services deciding just to erase their entire libraries just because they want to.
Yep.
But we will leave that for a discussion for another day. I want to talk about your art, but before we get to there, I just want to make sure we do kind of go over how each of the productions we're kind of focusing on here this season have decided to show off what Chromolume number 7 is auditorily.
Yeah.
Here's like the hard part. If this was my full-time job and could put in like 70 hours of like research time, I would go and discover if this was exactly how it basically was in the show, or if it's just a representation of what is happening in the show, because how it is put onto the albums is so vastly different. So do you remember, or do you recall, on the original Broadway cast album, how Chromolume number 7 is presented?
I don't. I will admit it's probably a skippable one for me.
Well, it's basically just a 20-second intro into the song, putting it together. Like, you don't hear George talking about the setup, like what it's even supposed to be about. It's just like the twinkly, like do like those little twinkly things that happen, and it's like when they're like, I'm not surprised, like that whole like refrain at the beginning of putting it together.
Yep.
So let's listen to that now. The London version is very different. So they put a bit of a book scene in front of it. He's introducing the Chromolume. This one runs, by my stopwatch here, roughly 30 seconds and uses the melody that are like those arpeggios that happen at the beginning of the song Sunday. Some people laugh, and then we go into putting it together.
Yeah.
So we should listen to that part now.
Not the arms. Real. Watch the push now.
The Broadway revival is the more interesting one because it's the longest one.
Yeah.
They do the kind of the same introduction that the London one does. But in this one, at least by my ear, I should point out, it has selections from Sunday, from Color and Light, and from Finishing the Hat. I guess my biggest question is, that I don't have an answer to, but would love it if people out there did know, were all of these done by Michael Starobin? Was this just like the music conductor figuring out what they wanted to put in? Like, I actually don't know how you decide, because they're all kind of different.
Yeah.
So it's not even like the same melody that they decided to use, but it's like this condensed entr'acte that they use as Chromolume number 7.
Yeah, I was watching these, these little moments in the original, like, filmed, and then the revival slime tutorial, and I was trying to like kind of pinpoint bits of the score that were used previously, and I think maybe only one time I really noticed, like, oh, that is distinctly from this particular song or whatever. But it was a very like abstracted, very futuristic sounding score that I think, and I was starting to figure out like why, like where did this come from, like what is this, what is this sound, and I wonder if it is meant to be, I guess like kind of distinctly different in each production, or like
it's hard to say. I mean, they're definitely synthesizers that they were using as far as instrumentation. The one from London, I could be completely making this up. I feel like I'm stretching a little bit. I swear that they intentionally make it kind of sound like the Phantom of the Opera overture just a tiny little bit. But again, I honestly have no idea if that's true, but it sounds very like organy, like dun, 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 like that kind of does that sort of thing in the background a little bit for me. I will say, like of all of these tracks, whether it's like put onto like the beginning of Putting It Together or its own separate track, I'm not like listening to these very often. I'm not like jumping to listen to Chromolume number 7.
Right.
But they are interesting, I think, theatrically to understand, like, okay, we get where this George is coming from, what his interests lie, at least in the modern world.
Yeah. And I think, maybe it was your episode with, I believe her name was Gina, who was defending her immediate dislike of the second act when she...
Oh, Gail. Gail.
Yeah. I think, like, there are a lot of ways in which the show kind of forces you to be uncomfortable about what we're seeing now. Like, the shift into modern day is very jarring. Or at least, like, we became so comfortable with these characters, and now we're in a new world. And we're introduced to different characters. And I think what we're also, in amongst like the book scenes and some of the other songs as well, like we're meant to feel like George is definitely not the same artist and is not the George that we knew. And George that is struggling with a lot to be connected with art and the art world and ideas of children and art and legacy. And I think, there are a lot of very obvious ways that's made clear. But then I think there are subtle things like the way in which the music just sounds disconnected from the whole show, at least in my ear. It doesn't sound like it fits.
I think that legacy piece is the biggest one. I think it's important that we start this by the characters of the painting talking about the legacy of Seurat. Then we get into the scene of the new George talking about like the legacy of George Seurat and his own like connection to his own family. We are seeing up front and center his legacy with these Chromolume number 7 that he's showing off. And then of course that's what the rest of the act is really focusing on, children and art, like the two things together as far as people can have as a legacy.
Yeah.
So it all thematically makes sense when you really start to pick it apart. Is there anything you wanted to add into that? Like, is there anything specifically that about George do you think that this says?
I think what George is doing as well, I think I kind of like I was saying before, George is a very knowledgeable person. Mm-hmm. And I think he just hasn't touched on those ideas of legacy. And I think the ideas that he has of using light in this sculpture, using light in Chromolume number 7, like the way in which George Seurat uses light was like inspiration. He was capturing light in the same way that he was capturing his subjects, the mm-hmm. people. He was kind of doing both, using paint to capture light and think about light in that way. Whereas George number 2 is using light as paint, or at least like that. In a lot of these productions, light is the medium.
Just sorry to interrupt, but just because this really jumped into my head as you just stated that, we've gone all this time without making the connection. It's called a chromolume.
Yeah.
When George Seurat used something called pointillism, which was also occasionally called chromoluminism.
Yes.
So there's that connection, and then chroma meaning color, luma meaning light. Yeah. Like, again, it's all kind of interconnected.
Yeah. Like, and I think, George would know that. George would absolutely, hold that reference. But what I think, the biggest problem with, George's chromolumes and what, Blair sort of points out, that like, they were really interesting once, that, he was really onto something. But I think what he was lacking was the subject, was a good subject. He had a good medium and process that was interesting, and especially for the time.
He needs to find his dot is what he needs to find.
Yeah, exactly. It not just his dot, but the scene, but the people. Like as much as Dot was an important character in the creation of that painting, like everybody there was just as important. He spent so much time, finding that right color and finding the ways in which these dogs were posed and where the monkey was, mm-hmm. Everybody was positioned so precisely, but also looked at and observed and considered very specifically. And George number 2 has no subject like that. As much as George Seurat in this fiction was not a I don't know, a kind and sociable person. Like, he was in dialogue with these people, you know, whether or not they like it. You know, he was seeing them and recording their lives in this way. And yeah, Chromolume number 7, there is the possibility that a Chromolume number 7 could be interesting, could be, you know, loaded with all sorts of you know, subject matter and really interesting theory. But it just does, at least the one that we see, it just doesn't have that. And I think, you know, Blair nails it on the head, is that you're onto something, but there's so much more for you to find. It's just, you know, this medium is not interesting to us anymore because we've seen you play around with it enough. Now go make good work. No, you know.
Yeah. We'll talk about that as we lead into kind of the wrap up here. Why don't you speak a little bit about your art? Like, what are you working on?
Yeah, my practice is a sort of mixed media one. One body of work that I have was revolved around astrophysics and spirituality, and sort of finding the humanism in very distant ideas like astrophysics and physics. I have been making work using mirrors and spray painting them and kind of etching into them. So making these very reflective, glittering images. Yeah, a lot of my work is very black and either white or ambient light. I just recently did a little talk at an art and science event at the Kennedy Center in DC, where I presented my this body of work. My work is, you know, varied, but that is a very big aspect of my work, at least at the moment.
Yeah, if people are if they're in the DC area, is it easy to come and see some of your work?
Yeah, currently I don't have anything on display yet, but I will be in the DC area, the Torpedo Factory Art Center, which is in Alexandria, Virginia. I will be a resident artist there starting next year, but I will be doing various public engagement events until in Alexandria until the end of this year. I've submitted a number of solo show proposals, and I am a semifinalist for a contemporary art award in Bethesda, Maryland. So fingers crossed for me on seeing some stuff installed pretty soon. But yeah, that's what I got going on.
My goal at some point is that I would like to see some of your work in person, because all I see of it is like pictures of it, which is good sometimes for this type of work, but it's not the same like being right in front of it.
Yes, please. My work, I feel like every artist wants to say, like, you know, you got to see it in person,
Mm-hmm.
But at least like my mirror work, you really do need to see it in person, because the ways in which the light is captured, the way that it flickers, the way that you yourself your eyes are reacting to the ambient light, and how you can see yourself just slightly, like, it is a very dynamic viewing experience, at least from what people have told me. So definitely, you know, needed to be seen in person rather than, you know, through a screen.
You know, I started out this conversation saying that there's been no installation that has ever like stayed with me, and I'm just realizing that is slightly a lie, because I'm not going to remember what their name was. If I can find it, then I'll insert it. But I went to this installation, or she worked with sound.
Yeah.
And you went into this room, and depending on where you stood, you would actually overhear different like snippets of conversation and stuff like that. So if you moved around, it would actually, like, the audioscape would kind of move around with you. It was one of the coolest things I've actually ever been a part of, because it gave you enough of like this story that was being told, but kind of where you were standing in the room.
I feel like I may know who this artist is. Mm-hmm. If it's the artist that I'm thinking of, which I can't think of her name either, but they work a lot with sound. They did a walking tour of DC where they sort of recorded these very strange ambient things, and you sort of like walk through DC, and they, like, I don't know, there was an auditorial art piece as you traveled through DC.
That's cool.
Even though I am not a massively technical artist in the way that George number 2 is, I do have some Chromolume ideas where I can make a Chromolume. I think a way that George is perhaps, you know, lacking in Chromolumes is finding a good subject. And I think if I were to make a Chromolume in dialogue with Sunday Afternoon and the Island of Le Grand Jatte, I think I would use video. There's such an interesting idea, the fact that like when George goes to the island, it's completely changed. It's not the same park anymore. What I think would be really interesting is to sort of overlap parks and maybe a fictionalized Le Grand Jatte Isle and through like videos of parks, people inhabiting these parks, and sort of overlapping it with what that island looks like now. But I think an abstraction of people existing in and amongst, the idea of being in a park on a Sunday. And I think there's some interesting sort of like socio-political sort of questioning possibilities that you can have with the fact that this park is no longer a park anymore. It's been industrialized. It's been, paved over, the ways in which I think you can use video, maybe abstract video, and enhance color, more specifically rather than just an image. I think that could be really interesting.
Could I talk with the dogs, though? That's my real question.
Yes. Got to have dogs, at least a monkey in there too. But I could absolutely see just like these various vignettes, maybe like, videos sort of spliced over top of one another, just really messily, chunked over top of one another to make this very abstracted image, which you can start to pick out little moments of somebody passing by, throwing a frisbee, existing in a park, existing on a Sunday, but the light and color is also very present in a very visual way. And make it big, project it large.
Okay, so the couple last questions we have here. If we were to look at the entire score, where are you placing Chromolume number 7? Is this top 3, middle 3, bottom 3? Where is it going?
It's bottom 3. I mean, like everything in this show is so is masterful, and this is a skip it on my listen list.
I think it's better than Move On. That's my hot take. No, that is of course a joke. I want someone actually to come on and defend that position. That would actually be really fascinating to me. The other one that I have now just realizing I did not prep you for at all. So if you've listened to any of the other episodes, maybe you know.
I've been prepped. Yes.
This show is of course based on a painting. Is there something odd that you think would make, or that you would want to see be turned into a musical?
Yeah, I was trying to rack my brain of things outside of art in the art world, but I'm so deep in it that I can't separate my mind away from that. There was an artist in very prominently in New York in the 80s, Felix Gonzalez Torres, who was a gay man living in New York in the height of the AIDS epidemic, and a lot of his work, folks may recognize his work by piles of candy. People have also seen 2 clocks installed, and one clock is broken. He has like these piles of paper. These candy piles and piles of paper are takeable. You're able to grab them and be a part of that installation. And a particular candy piece was just a pile of candy weighing a certain amount that was the weight of his partner before he was diagnosed with AIDS. And so over time, visitors taking candy pieces would slowly diminish the weight of his partner and in the same way that AIDS did. So all that to say, I think there would be such an interesting way in which you can utilize a very charged and intense moment in New York history and gay history and art history, and looking at perhaps not just Felix, but also this time, trying not to get a little too hokey with the fact that like a lot of these issues are still very fresh, and a lot of these these rights are still in question. But I think it could be a very, very interesting show, especially with the fact that Felix's work was very avant-garde and very interactable. I feel like there could be really some interesting possibilities of avant-garde theater and very immersive theater.
I like that.
I don't know if I would have the expertise, but I can be a creative, advisor. Yeah, exactly.
I love that. Thank you so much for joining me here today. Lucas, if people wanted to see what you're up to, follow you online, what is the easiest way to do so?
My website is ljrart.com or lucasjrougeux.com. And Lucas J. Rougeux is my Instagram handle, so you can find me on Instagram. I'm posting work I'm very consistently there, but you can look at my website for all the other things that I've done in the past and will continue to do. But thanks so much, Kyle. This was such a joy.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Thank you so much for listening. You can send emails to puttingittogetherpodcast@gmail.com. You can also follow Sondheim Podcast on Twitter and Instagram. This is an independent production, and you can support the show on Patreon by going to patreon.com/puttingittogetherpodcast. Putting Together is available on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Spotify, and pretty much anywhere you get podcasts from. Consider subscribing so that you never miss an episode. Next week, we're going to be talking about the namesake of this very podcast, Putting It Together, the podcast that itself is becoming more and more about less and less. As always, a big thank you to the great Chris Taniguchi, who designed the podcast artwork, and to Nick Driscoll for composing our theme music. Well, we've reached the end of our episode. Yes, I know. Goodbye for now.